Well, hello, I'm Kate Hampton, and I'm really excited to be here with Meg Garcetti. Hello, Eric, how are you?
I'm doing great, Kate. It's wonderful to be with you. We've had such fun with past collaborations. I'm really looking forward to this interview.
And I'm guessing you've still got better weather than we have.
Yeah, it's nice. Here in California, it's about 72 degrees. I know nobody knows how to convert that outside of America, but it's a good temperature and sunny. It's a beautiful California day.
Okay, please don't rub it in. Into the question. So I've been working on climate change for a long time, and in that time, I've seen you establish Los Angeles as one of the real examples globally. So did you always plan to make Los Angeles a climate leader, or is that something that grew on you in the job?
I think it started before the job, but it certainly has grown on, I hope, all of us as human beings over the last 2 decades. I think about growing up in a very polluted Los Angeles, which had the worst air quality anywhere in America, where mothers took gas masks to protest at City Hall, and where it's rumored that children who grew up when I did have about 75% the lung capacity we should, simply because of the smog and the way that our lungs would burn on the worst days, which were called stage 3 smog alerts. And I grew up at the intersection of 2 freeways, more or less, with a cancer cluster on my street, even with my family that who knows, but could be related to that pollution. So I think it was those ingredients were very personal about the impact of the environment. But then in college, I took a class with somebody named Wallace Broker. And I'll confess to you, Professor Broker's class, I was told was one of the easier science requirements. So in order to fulfill my science requirement, I took a class called The Design and Maintenance of a Habitable Planet, the same year that the United Nations put out its first science report on global climate change. And it was Professor Broker who came up with the term global warming. And I think, looking back, the seeds that he planted, it was a wonderful course. It was mostly about how the earth had been formed and about geology. But the last part was about the human impact. And he passed on just a few years ago, but the predictions that he made about global warming have been borne out, as well as I hope the hope that he showed that when we took action to combat it, what we could do to restore this earth. And I think, those were the seeds that were planted long before I was an elected official.
Well, it's interesting that you mention air pollution, because that's a problem that all cities share. We recently had in London a girl whose inquest showed that she was killed by air pollution, the first person to have air pollution on their death certificate. And it's a really good entry point, I think, into climate change, but it also raises really difficult questions around environmental justice, climate justice. So can you talk a little bit about how social inequities have played out in Los Angeles and how you're building it into your climate change agenda?
Absolutely. I think that, we always see whether it's economic deprivation or social deprivation, or in this case, health deprivations, it happens in those areas that because of either economic discrimination, racial discrimination, gender discrimination, those are the communities that are always on the front line, hardest hit, and have, the worst health indicators, shortest lives, highest incidence of disease. That's no different here in Los Angeles. And I know we have a great reputation, well earned, as the entertainment capital of the world, but it wasn't Hollywood that built Los Angeles. It was actually oil. In fact, in the late 20s, a quarter of all the oil that was extracted in the world came out of the Los Angeles basin. And so, fortunes were made. There's been plenty of movies about this where, you see in California, but Southern California in particular, what that impact was like. But then suddenly a huge city was built on top of these massive oil fields. So that means people have in their backyards old oil rigs. At the Port of Los Angeles, which together with the Twin Port of Long Beach is responsible for 40% of all the goods that come into the country, which we're seeing all the ships backed up, the air pollution for communities that are there on the front line. So we've always, from the beginning, when we put out our sustainability plans, when I became mayor, kind of had the 3 E's, of course, the environment, but also equity and the economy. And that equity piece and the second and the third one, the jobs piece, was really important to me, because this isn't just about statistics. This isn't just about saving the earth. This is about improving people's lives and addressing the inequities that cause you to live a shorter life depending on the zip code you live in. And I'm very proud that whether it's putting EVs into our lowest income communities first for EV share programs, expanding solar power for renters and for others who might not be able to buy in a home that they own, or looking at the way that environmental justice impacts people where the industrial facilities are located, that really has been our North Star guiding almost every action we've taken.
Mm. And you mentioned vested interests, oil. It's really complicated, disentangling vested interests from legitimate concerns about jobs, and then the needs of local communities. And then when you layer on top of that COVID and the difficulties that people have faced, livelihoods challenged, job insecurity, how do you balance all of that? And how has COVID impacted your climate change plans?
That's a really good question, because this is, I hope for all of us as human beings, been one of the most reflective moments of our life. First faced with the trauma of the loss of loved ones and the shutting down of life as we knew it, the economic hardships that came with that, in our country, the calls for racial justice that also echoed around the world. This is a moment where if you're not thinking hard about who you are and your place in the world and how you lead, then you're never going to. For me, it's certainly been a really reflective moment about going bolder, being more creative, being more collaborative. I kind of call the lessons of this pandemic the 4 8s. And I don't mean the number 8, but ATE. First is just accelerate. You can't wait when a pandemic is in front of you, making decisions like shutting down, the places of gathering, which LA did first, or mandating masks or testing and, moving forward with vaccine. You have to accelerate when you're faced with a crisis, whether it's a pandemic or the climate. Second, you have to innovate. Stop looking to other people or other job descriptions or other bureaucracies or other organizations to do the work. Go completely outside of your lane and be innovative. The city of LA didn't have a public health department. That's something that our county of Los Angeles has. That didn't matter. We had firefighters who were brilliant medical workers who could do some of the largest testing sites in the world. So innovation was really key. When it comes to climate, we're going to all have to innovate the way we live, the way we have companies working, our economy, whether we can get to a circular economy rather than just a growth economy. Third is collaborate. Stop also staying inside your lane in terms of the people you work with. So find your partners everywhere. Young people are crying out for action, but we haven't given them a lot of bridges on how to empower them for action. So their voices are mostly critical ones right now because they're not empowered in enough cities. So whether it's a youth mayor's climate council that I have that advises me and actually is empowered to make decisions, or whether you're looking at non-traditional organizations that are maybe racial justice organizations that haven't focused on climate, bringing them in, collaborate. And then I think the fourth thing that I learned from this year is communicate. Communicate. During the pandemic, I had a nightly address on all of our channels every night just to explain what this disease was, what the coronavirus was, why we were making decisions. There's not a lot of good translators about climate change right now. They're either complete experts or they're people who are like, I don't get this until it floods my community. And there aren't people in between doing the hard work of kind of being explainers in chief, of building a narrative of how we can go from desperation to progress. And so I hope that all of us are kind of changing how we lead. We're a lot less formal, we're more frictionless with everything we do, and we're maybe a little bit less arrogant about leading. And instead now we're about building and bringing others in while we don't ask for permission.
You mentioned a few things here that have triggered a bunch of questions for me. I'll come back to the question about youth soon, because I know it's a passion that you and I share, engaging young people in climate action. But you mentioned something about communication, and we've seen with COVID and with climate change that scientific literacy and how you communicate to the public is a really, really crucial point in terms of keeping people safe and how people evaluate risks and how they engage with science in public discourse. Can you share with me what you think the key elements are to really communicating? Huge complexity, and you mentioned desperation. Sometimes these things are so overwhelming. So going into COP26, what's your advice to other leaders about getting those difficult messages across, but maintaining some level of hope?
I would say make it personal and make it human rather than statistical. I think people who specialize in things, whether they're wonderful advocates calling on governments to reduce CO2 by this many tons a year, percentages, most human beings don't think that way. Those are critical roles. We need those experts. We need those discussions at a high level. But like you said earlier, people understand pollution, polluted air, whether it was Los Angeles in the 1950s or Beijing when the US Embassy in Beijing began to share what the air quality was, and then Chinese citizens who were there in Beijing began to call on their government and other cities to clean up the air. it personalizes it because we all can relate to things that are about our community. Keep it local. Don't just talk about, the flooding happening someplace else, but whether it's migration flows, whether it's extreme weather, drought, fires, really tailor it to what's happening so that people can say, oh yeah, I've seen that and I've felt that. And third, I would say be urgent but humble. I think so often the more arrogant we are, the fewer people will work on this. The more humble we are about this, the more we realize that this is something for the entire tribe to do. The human tribe has to figure this out together. There has to be a place for everyone. And yes, there should be strident attacks where there's inaction, but we also have to convince 100% of human beings in 100% of the places that we live to deal with 100% of this climate if this is going to be successful and maximized. So it's not about being right or wrong. It's not about necessarily what people did last year or didn't do. It's about engaging people to make the change tomorrow and then the day after that and the day after that, something more each time. In LA, we've tried to translate it also to something that people can wrap their head around to understand that it's the 5 zeros. Zero emission electricity, zero emission transportation, zero carbon buildings, zero wasted water, and zero waste. So people can go from the recycling to the drought to, the building I live in and what I'm going to make sure it's, how the power is coming in there, the way I move around the city and where my electricity comes from. That begins to give people a game plan to plug in, no pun intended, however they can best.
And coming back to this question of young people, I mean, it is indeed an everyone, everywhere now problem. Everybody needs to get engaged with climate change. But there are a lot of young people going into COP26 thinking, look, you've been having these UN summits for a long time. I myself have been going to them for nearly 30 years. What's it really amounting to? Can we trust corporations? Can we trust political leaders? So you've had some direct experience. You've had a youth advisory council in your own city. How have you given those young people a sense of agency, because they have so much to offer, but they may not have the experience, the technical capability? So how do you find a real role for them that's meaningful, that's not tokenistic?
Well, and I'd love to hear your input on that. I know you're asking me the questions, but after I finish, chime in too, because you've been such a great leader in engaging young people in countries around the world. And it's been what some of the joy of the last year is being with you as we listen to young people, because they come up with the answers even better than whatever I could come up with myself. But I would say two things. I would say what big change has happened does come from these convenings, and they're critically important. Don't just dismiss them. The big jumps that have happened, even though they haven't jumped far enough, but they're pretty dramatic when you look back 10, 20 years ago, or even the way we dealt with the ozone. Those can come from the world community coming together, the civic society, civil society pressuring leaders and making sure that there's positive outcomes. But second, I would say don't fetishize the national level or even your city level. Focus on what you do control. A city is only made up of the millions of people who live there. A nation is made up of all the local, municipalities. When President Trump made moves to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords, the only country in the world that was doing that, I didn't cry in a corner. I picked up the phone and started calling local community leaders, other mayors. And we went from, a dozen to 24 to 50 to 100 to over 500 cities led by Democrats, yes, but also Republicans and independent mayors who said, if he's getting out of Paris, we're in. And we kept up the pace of meeting our Paris climate accords by ignoring Washington instead of fetishizing Washington. So my message would also be, what can you control? And remember, a country and a nation is made up of you too, not just those so-called leaders. But I'd be curious what you've seen that works too.
Well, just from my personal experience, being a young climate campaigner, I mean, probably quite a long time before this generation, but sitting in a room with a bunch of electrical engineers telling me that renewable energy would never work, it would never get beyond 5% of the electricity system, it was too expensive, you couldn't run, a country on renewables, and here we are. And I was right and they were wrong. And I think we have to embrace the vision that young people have, because they can see things differently. They're not as constrained, and as you go through life you see more barriers. So I think we have to find a way to channel that enthusiasm, and I think you're right, it needs to be practical and it needs to be local, because they need to see progress to continue to believe that change is possible. So I'm hoping that young people are going to get involved locally. They don't need to be in Glasgow to make a change, but they can make a real difference at home.
And I'd add one thing is, don't talk down to them. I mean,
Absolutely.
you've been there, I've been there. share with them all the information, because I think it's not just a young person who will be strident or yell at you or say that all you're saying is blah, 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 when all you're giving them is what you're not doing. But if you don't share the science with them, for instance, when we did our groundbreaking study to get to 100% renewable energy, 100% carbon-free electricity grid, it was something called LA 100. We used our National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They ran tens of millions of supercomputer scenarios and showed us that it was cheaper, more dependable, and that it could be done 97% of the way by the end of this decade. The last 3% will take about 5 more years because of some of the complexities. Young people love that. They're students. They're probably smarter than us right now. They're more used to reading things, studying, understanding that. So the more you peripheralize people, the more strident their voices will become. The more you include them in the information, they're going to not only add something useful, but they'll understand and own that moment more.
That comes back to your point about arrogance. There's a lot of tactical arrogance in climate change. We have to do it this way, we have to do it that way. And yet many of the solutions are things that will be created in the coming years that haven't been done already. So just one final question, Eric. So, the world has come out of COVID, with different capabilities. I mean, rich countries have been able to throw money at the problem. Your government, my government have literally been printing money to help people out of the crisis. And there are lots of people hurting in the US, in the UK, and around the world. But it's nothing compared to the insecurity that's felt in some of the poorest geographies in the world. And the developing world megacities really need access to solutions, to capital, jobs, clean air, all the things that we talk about. But a factor of 10. So can you talk just finally a little bit about your experience of C40 and how, as a mayor with such different cities, you were able to find common cause in the fight against climate change, but that really took into consideration the inequities globally and the different levels of financing and capability around the world?
Absolutely. Look, it's been the greatest honor of my life to lead C40, which is misnamed because we're actually 97 cities, but we stopped at 40. We're basically the 100 most populous cities of the world, more or less. These giant metropolises, probably responsible about a quarter of the world's GDP. And that network of mayors, whether it was during the pandemic, getting together to figure out how to pass information and save lives when it came to COVID, or whether it's been the ongoing work that we do on the climate crisis. It is very important to always have that global perspective. A place like Africa that will have immense growth in population and economy, who hasn't caused the majority of the emissions or anywhere near a majority of the emissions, but is suffering from the impact of the weather changes and needs to mitigate what's happening. We have to look at both adaptability and mitigation. We have to fund not just helping us who are already rich deal with, our insurance rates going up and the frontline communities who are almost always poorer in our more developed countries, but looking at those countries that want to do the right thing, want to develop and have a higher, standard of living, but really need the financing now. When you look at a country like India that's made, pledge to go to 450 gigawatts of renewable power, but we need to collectively help finance that through private and public sources. When we look at African cities, and I can get on a conference call and be with the mayors of places like London and Paris and Tokyo, but also with Freetown and with Quezon City and Jakarta and Bogota and other places where you realize the challenges come differently. But if we have solidarity across the globe in terms of saying anybody's work against climate change is all of our work, we are a rich enough world to be able to help finance that. And I hope that comes out loud and clear at Glasgow or in Glasgow. We have a responsibility when it comes to vaccine equity. We have a responsibility when it comes to climate equity. We have a responsibility to just making sure that all the good work we might do selfishly in our area doesn't make us lose the war on climate change, because the growth of Africa, of South Asia and other places make all of those gains washed away. So do it selflessly, but also do it selfishly to bank your wins, to bank your gains in a much more effective way. And I refuse to be pessimistic. I think there's an awakening happening. I feel it among my peers. I feel that those bonds have never been closer. I feel like the coalitions have never been stronger, but we all know the urgency has never been greater.
Well, thanks so much, Eric. And you've been an absolutely fabulous chair of the C40. It's been a real joy to work with you from the perspective of civil society. And going into the COP, we all have you to thank for really strengthening the voice of cities. And I really hope that cities can be a beacon of hope for their citizens, and also an exemplar for national leaders as they face the real test of our generation in the next 2 weeks. So thank you ever so much. And in your new role, please don't give up on your climate work. I look forward to seeing you in Delhi.
All right, I can't wait. Next year in Delhi, as they say. Thanks, Kate. Great to be with you.
Thank you.
All right.